worldly man, widely read, very smart, sees a big picture. All of that goes back to that, that little interaction with Barry Harris. It's good to remember that our music teachers are teaching oftentimes a lot more than just how D minor goes to G7. And Barry, Barry was also teaching, when John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins and Cannonball Adderley and guys like that would come to Detroit, they would all fall by Barry's house to see what the maestro was working on. Charles has stories about, John Coltrane coming over and pulling up a chair and saying, "Hey, what are you working on?" And Barry would say, "Well, I've been thinking about how in a 2-5-1 progression, if you want, you don't have to don't think about the 2 chord, the minor chord. Just play on the dominant chord, the 5 chord, and here's a scale that will work for that." And these are things that have profound implications for the way John Coltrane then ends up sort of playing, and ideas, and they work their way into jazz, the mainstream of the jazz vocabulary, and you can trace a lot of that stuff back to Barry in certain ways. So that takes us up to about 1960. Then the question is, when the city turns south in the 1960s and 70s, how do we keep the jazz tradition going? And there are a couple of answers to that. One of the really important answers is in the 1960s and 70s, we have some very important musician cooperatives and self-determination efforts that sprout in Detroit. The 2 most important of these are the Strata Corporation and the Tribe Organization, and we're going to hear in detail about Tribe in a little bit. But what I want to say at this point is that there was a zeitgeist basically within African American communities at this time in the 1960s and 70s, in a response to the later part of the 1960s and a change in the civil rights movement. And there was a notion that if we want to do this, we're not getting support from the mainstream of the culture. We're not getting support from record companies. We're not getting support from the clubs. We need to do it ourselves. We need to take it upon ourselves to do this. And the most famous of these organizations nationally is probably the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, the AACM, as it's known, in Chicago. And there's a group, the Black Artist Group in St. Louis, and there's a group in New York, and there's a group in Los Angeles, and in Detroit. As I said, our major groups are Strata and Tribe. And but I want to say that it's interesting that while this sprouts in the 1960s and 70s, we actually have some precursors in Detroit, specifically the New Music Society, which Kenny Burrell founded in 1953, was an early example of this. Kenny was still a student at Wayne State. He was the president of this organization. They organized concerts and jam sessions at the World Stage, which was a theater in Hamtramck, just a couple of miles north of Wayne State. They sold tickets. It was by subscription. There were members, and it's an early example of this. Whoa, that shouldn't have happened. Sorry about that. I leave the phone on because I've got the music. So that's the first time all this time that's happened. Sorry about that. I think what I'll do is turn the ringer off so that won't happen again. So the New Music Society is going in like 1954, 55. And as I said, it's an early example of that. And we should remember that Detroit, historically has been a locus of African-American intellectualism. We have major poets, major artists, major thinkers in the city, African-Americans. The Nation of Islam was founded in Detroit in the first part of the 20th century. So there are some cultural roots that make Detroit kind of a natural place where some of these ideas would take root. The Strata Corporation is an organization that's founded by Ken Cox, who I mentioned at the beginning, a pianist, and Charles Moore, a trumpet player. And they have a really interesting idea. They decide that, first of all, they're playing in a band called the Contemporary Jazz Quintet, which was basically a Miles Davis, Miles Davis influenced band in the late 60s. And that band made a couple of records for Blue Note, had a quick shot at some national attention, and they didn't like the way the relationship went with Blue Note. They couldn't get Blue Note to come out and record them in Detroit, and it was frustrating for them. And that helped lead them toward the idea of maybe we should do this ourselves. And so they start Strata, and it's really modeled on like Motown or a Columbia. It's modeled on a for-profit. Their idea is for-profit. They have artistic ideals, but they want to do it for profit. And they start they sell stock, which is highly unusual, to raise capital. And they're going to start a management booking division, a record. They're going to make records. They have concert production. They run a concert gallery. And they were never able to sell to raise enough money to really support all of these things. And the model did not work well for them because since they were working on they thought of themselves as a record company in the old sense. They were trying to create contracts that were based on the same model, so that the company itself would pay for the upfront costs of recording and distributing, and then the musicians would make the money on the back end. Well, if you don't have enough capital to make the records, it makes it very difficult. And so that's one reason why there were only a few Strata records that ever came out in the 1970s. So there are issues there, but the concert gallery becomes really important. It becomes a real locus for jazz in Detroit in the 1970s. And so people like Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock's sextet, Chick's first trio reiteration of Return to Forever play there. Charles Mingus plays there. Ornette Coleman played there. Joe Henderson, Elvin Jones, Joe Chambers. The Tribe folks played there. Other Detroiters played at the concert gallery. It's hard to remember kind of that there was a time when people like Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock couldn't get a gig at Baker's Keyboard Lounge. But at that point, they couldn't. And so they played. And in fact, a recording just came out last year of Charles Mingus Group from 1973 that was recorded at the Strata Concert Gallery. Those concerts were broadcast on, many of them were broadcast on WDET public radio, and those tapes have circulated for a while, and one of those tapes ended up getting released this past year. Strata also gave birth to Strata East, which is an organization founded on the East Coast by Charles Tolliver, a trumpet player, and Stanley Cowell, a pianist. They've recorded a lot of records, became very well known. Now we're at the point where most people have heard of Strata East, but they hadn't actually heard of Strata. But those guys from Tolliver and Stanley Cowell, particularly Stanley Cowell, who had gone to school at the University of Michigan and played with all the Detroiters, they came to Detroit to see what our guys were doing. And they decided there was a plan to have satellites of Strata all over the country. There'd be a Strata East, a Strata West. In the end, they decided to kind of go it alone, but they kept the name. And so it's interesting, that really has Detroit roots. Tribe took a different approach. They created a record label, but it wasn't, they didn't have these corporate aspirations that Strata did. Artists would bring in the finished masters, the recordings to them, and then Tribe would package them and put them out. And Tribe also published a magazine. I'm going through this quickly because we're going to talk about this with Phil and Wendell, but they published a magazine, which was really unusual. There are no other organizations of their type that did this. But the magazine ends up being an Afrocentric themed magazine. They sell advertising, and Wendell told me that it became so successful it helped fund all the other concerts and all the other things that the organization was doing, covering, you know, really, in the language of the day, getting down to the nitty-gritty. Abortion, police brutality, all kinds of urban issues, poverty and the like, all covered in that magazine. In fact, Wendell said to me that at one point by 1976 or 1977, when they stopped, he had to stop because he didn't get into this to become a magazine publisher. He wanted to play the saxophone. There was too much other stuff taking his attention away. But Tribe made a number of really great records. Phil's records are fantastic. Marcus Belgrave made a good record for Tribe. Harold McKinney made a good record. Wendell made a couple of records there. They've a great legacy. And those original Tribe recordings are collector's items. I mean, you know, it's astounding, but those records are going for $500 or more on eBay. They've been reissued many times, and you can hear them all. And in fact, there's a new Tribe recording that's coming out in a week or two. It's out now. That shows the Tribe musicians sort of all the way up until the present day. So it's interesting, though, we sort of do it our way in Detroit. It's a little different. These self-determination efforts in other cities were basically almost all organized around free jazz, the avant-garde. If you think about the AACM in Chicago in particular, but also the Black Artist Group in Detroit. And in Detroit, our stuff, it's definitely progressive, and there's definitely free jazz in the mix, but there's also early fusion and early experiments with electronics, and you can hear some Motown and funk in there too. It's a much more of a kind of melange of elements, and it's gritty, consciousness raising in the language of that era, and intensely local. And what's also unique to Detroit is that we have white musicians involved in these organizations in a way that they did not in other places. In fact, in Chicago, they were kicking white musicians out of the AACM by the late 60s. And in Detroit, we had white musicians that had leadership roles in Strata and were on the records at Tribe. And you think about, well, okay, so how did that happen? Well, it's two things. Let's go back to the schools. The schools were integrated. So we had a culture in Detroit where black and white musicians worked together. They had grown up together playing in schools, in bands, after school, and that kind of structural institution building within a city makes a difference. The other thing that's really important in Detroit is that our musicians local was integrated too. Historically, there were two musicians locals in the United States that were integrated before the early 1950s, and those were New York and Detroit. All the others were separate until they began amalgamating in the early 1950s. Chicago's two separate unions, musicians unions, don't amalgamate till 1967. That's really late. I mean, that's really late. And so, again, we have these institutions that have black and white musicians together. Now, that does not mean that there wasn't structural racism in the way the music business worked in Detroit. And it doesn't mean that, the white musicians got the best theater gigs, the best commercial gigs, the recordings, all of that stuff. But still, there was an infrastructure here. And that led to actually some funny stories. One day, Ron English, who's a white guitarist, is still around, still playing, was at a party at the house of his best friend, who was an African-American drummer named Bobby Battle. And Bobby is up, they're in a party, there's about 7 or 8 guys there, they're all black except for Ron. And Bobby is standing up and giving a sermon, and he's kind of on a roll, and at one point he says, quoting the Firebrand poet Amiri Baraka, he says, "The white man at best is merely corny." And then he turns around and he says, "No offense, Ron." So the other way we keep all this going in Detroit is the culture of mentorship. First of all, this old formula of the schools and the mentorship working together. That continues up through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, into the, our school musically stay strong all the way up until the early 2000s when the schools get put under emergency management. It's not till then that they actually, that things really fall to the wayside. So, so that's happening, but the mentorship. And we have lots of mentors in Detroit. Donald Walden, a saxophone player, Kenny Cox, the pianist, Harold McKinney, the pianist, Wendell Harrison. All of these people are important, but Marcus Belgrave becomes sort of the dominant mentor. And I have a whole section in my book is called Marcus Belgrave and His Children. And his children are Jerry Allen, Kenny Garrett, Bob Hurst, Rodney Whitaker, Gerald Cleaver, Kareem Riggins, Regina Carter, all these musicians who come up basically under Marcus's wing. Marcus is a trumpet player who gets sort of builds his career with Ray Charles in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And in 1963, he's looking for a place to get off the road, and he decides to come to Detroit. Why does he come here? Well, he knows about the great jazz tradition that's from here. And in particular, he knows that his idol Thad Jones comes from Detroit, and he wants to get a part of whatever produced Thad. And he knows that Motown is here, and he can get work in the Motown studios. And so he comes here in 1963, and by 1970, 71, he's beginning to teach. Marcus essentially adopted talented kids. And a good example is Bob Hurst, the bass player. Marcus they met at Rochester High School, where Bob was going to school in the suburbs. Bob was 15, a sophomore, and Marcus went out to give a clinic and give a concert. And at the clinic, Bob came up to him and said, "Hey, Mr. Belgrave, would it be okay if we played a duet together on the concert?" And Marcus thought, well, that's kind of a precocious thing to ask, but sure, why not? What do you want to play? And Bob says, well, let's play Confirmation. So Confirmation is a song by Charlie Parker. And so they're going to rehearse it. They start to rehearse it, and they start to play, and Bob starts to play the melody along with Marcus. Now, Confirmation is a very complicated, tricky song to play. It's hard to play on any instrument, much less the bass, much less a bass player at age 15. And so Marcus hears this and immediately goes to Bob's parents and says, your kid is gifted. I'd like to work with him if that would be okay. And from then on, every Saturday and Sunday, one of his parents would schlep him down to the city, and Bob would hang out with Marcus all day rehearsing. And that story gets repeated a lot with Jerry Allen, with Kenny Garrett. Regina Carter told me, this community raised us. This community raised us. There's a good story. Some of you may know it, some of you may not, but our host, Rodney Whitaker, at 13 years old, was carrying his bass home for the first time. And he played violin earlier, but now he's playing the bass. He's carrying the bass home, and a neighbor sees him. And the neighbor runs out, and the neighbor's holding 2 records. And the guy says, hey, here are these 2 records, and the 2 bass players, Paul Chambers is on one and Ron Carter is on the other, and both these guys went to Cass Tech, and maybe you could go to Cass Tech and when you get older. And Ronnie's like sort of overwhelmed by this. And the guy said to him, you're part of the legacy now. So Ronnie goes home, and he asks his mother, what does legacy mean? And she says, look it up in the dictionary. And he goes upstairs, and he puts on the records, one of the records is John Coltrane's record called Soul Train. And on one side starts with, I think it's side 2, starts with a song called Good Bait by Tad Dameron. And Rodney puts that on. Here's Paul Chambers play the solo on Good Bait. And the next morning he gets up, he goes downstairs, tells his parents he wants to be a jazz musician. So, this idea that, it takes a village, that's what happens in Detroit. The whole village, whole city raises these musicians. Today, if Marion Hayden, who's a great bass player, Ralph Armstrong, bass player, they're both functioning as mentors in Detroit, as well as they're, traveling widely to perform. And, if they see a talented kid, they go right to the parents. They get, I don't know how many instruments, how many basses Ralph has given to kids or given to Cass Tech. And it is no coincidence that Rodney runs the jazz program here, that Bob Hurst is teaching at Michigan, that Jerry Allen taught at Michigan for 10 years before she went to the University of Pittsburgh for a couple of years, her alma mater, and then, of course, we sadly lost Jerry a couple of years ago to cancer. But it's no coincidence that these people have all ended up teaching, because, as I said, the culture of the culture of mentorship is built into the DNA of Detroit. Wendell's teaching all the time. It's part of what you do if you're a jazz musician in Detroit. And it's not teaching like, guys, people come over and they give you $20 and you teach them for a half an hour. I mean, it's like mentorship. I mean, you are part of their lives, which means you talk to them about what it's like to be a musician, you show them, you feed them, you are part of their lives. And that's what we do in Detroit. Rodney says in the book, we make cars. In Detroit, we make cars and we make jazz musicians. Those are the two things we do best. So I'm going to read a little bit more and play a little music, so you get a little bit more of a hint of what the book is about. So give me a second to set this up, and I'll do a little bit of this, and then I'll bring Wendell and Phil up, and we'll have a conversation about Tribe. A critic once suggested that if the Detroit-born vibraphonist Milt Jackson ever played an unswinging phrase, he must have done so in private. But odds are that not even the woodshed heard Jackson trip over an awkward rhythm or improvise a melody that didn't bloom with lyricism or leave the scent of the blues hanging in the air. Jackson, who died in 1999 at age 76, was perhaps the most naturally swinging and soulful musician in jazz for decades. Timing is everything in jazz, and Jackson's control of rhythm was legendary. He created drama through relaxation and contrast. He'd strike notes behind the beat and then dart ahead, climbing over the top of the pulse before retreating to the backside of the beat. He personalized each note with his own articulation. Serpentine lines merged with repeated note triplet jabs that cut like a scalpel. The result was a charged forward momentum that still felt nonchalant. Jackson's improvisations at medium and fast tempos were ebullient outbursts of bebop melody, sly grace notes, witty triplets, and blues allusions that hung on his phrases like Christmas ornaments. His ballads shivered with eroticism. The sound he drew from the vibes pulsated with the warm vibrations of human feeling. Jackson wasn't just riffing on common forms when he played a 12-bar blues or a standard ballad. He was speaking from his heart, telling stories that reaffirmed the African-American aesthetics of jazz. The cultural critic Albert Murray might have said that Jackson transformed Negro experience into high style and offered heroic affirmation in the face of adversity. Vibraphonist Warren Wolf put it more colloquially. When Milt played the blues, it not only sounded good, it felt good, and it made you feel good too. So that's Milt Jackson from 1952 with a song called True Blues, with basically an first iteration of what became the Modern Jazz Quartet, with John Lewis playing piano, Percy Heath on bass, and the drummer on that was Kenny Clark. Sheila Jordan reached a crossroads in 1987. The Detroit-born singer was 58 and known to a small cadre of musicians and insiders as a treasure of unconventional expression and magical spontaneity. She was also only recently sober after decades of alcohol abuse and a short but intense battle with cocaine. A single mother, Jordan had worked for more than 20 years as a typist at Doyle Dane Bernbach, a Manhattan advertising agency. She used her vacation time for sporadic touring and recording. But now the agency was merging with another company and she had a choice. She could stay on as a roving secretary or she could retire with a year's severance pay. I started to cry, Jordan said in 2011. I was so upset. I thought, oh my God, I'm losing my job. I don't think I want to float around from office to office. And then a voice said to me real clear, you've been praying that you'd sing more, so shut up and take the money and run. For the last 3 decades, Jordan, who turned 90 in 2018, has traveled the world performing, recording, and teaching. Once a cult figure, she has entered the pantheon. At 83, she was named a 2012 NEA Jazz Master by the National Endowment for the Arts. The nation's highest honor in jazz, the $25,000 prize, put an exclamation point on the autumnal flowering of her career. It was a warm hug from the establishment after a lifetime in the shadows, where she overcame an impoverished childhood, bigotry, drink, and drugs, abusive men, and hardships of the jazz life. She willed herself into greatness. There is no sound in jazz quite like Jordan in her prime. She transformed an unlikely featherweight soprano into a gossamer instrument, dancing unpredictably through time and pitch like a butterfly riding a gust of wind. She phrases like a horn. Her primary influences have been instrumentalists, especially alto saxophonist Charlie Parker, the Prometheus of bebop, who dubbed her the kid with the $1 million ears when she was a teenager in Detroit in the 1940s. Jordan improvises on many levels, slyly bending the familiar lyrics of the standard into fresh melodic shapes. Sometimes she makes up new lyrics on the spot, turning an ad-lib blues into a charmingly discursive ramble. She's an irrepressible swinger and an elite scat singer. Her taste for adventurous improvisation makes her a kind of white twin to Betty Carter, an African-American, and the other influential post-war jazz vocalists from Detroit. Unlike some jazz singers who get so hung up trying to improvise that they make a mess of a song's meaning, Jordan's variations almost always deepen the intent of a lyric rather than obscure it. Even today, with age having taken a toll on the once pristine purity of her voice and intonation, she can still bring listeners to tears with a ballad. Exactly how she does this is a mystery, though the answer has something to do with the beguiling alchemy of her plain-spoken honesty, narrative instincts, and the authority of her time and phrasing.
I used to visit all the very gay places, the come-what-may places, where one relaxes on the axis of the wheel of life to get the feel of life from jazz and cocktails. The men I knew had sad and sullen gray faces with disdain gay traces. That used to be where you could see that they'd been washed away by too many through the day. 12 cocktails. Then you came along with your siren song to tell me to madness. I thought for a while that your poignant smile was tinged with the sadness of a great love for me. Oh yes, I was wrong. Again, I was wrong. Last year, everything seemed so sure. Now life is awful again. A trough full of hearts would only be a bore. A trip to Paris might ease a bite of it all. I care is to smile in spite of it. I'll forget you, I will, while yet you are still burning inside my brain. Romance is mush, stifling those who strive. I'll live a lush life in some small dive, and there I will be while I rot with the rest of those whose lives are lonely too.
So that's Sheila in 1977 with a bass player named Errol Anderson and singing Billy Strayhorn's Lush Life. So I think, given what time it is, I'll stop and I will bring Wendell and Phil up and we'll have a conversation. As I do that, I think I'll play a little bit of some Tribe music just to kind of set the mood. When we are done, I do want to say, sorry for the commercial, I actually have books here. If anybody wants to buy one, I can sign them, and I can even, if I do it right, I can even take credit cards now. So let me play something for you.